From January through March, a German soldier died every 7 seconds. And it was mostly from starvation. And they knew this. They knew that a German soldier died every 7 seconds. How did they know this? Well, because the Soviet army put it on loudspeakers. They brought loudspeakers up to the front. And for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they played a message. A German soldier dies every 7 seconds. Bang. A German soldier dies every 7 seconds. Wow. Bang. Psychological warfare for months and months and months.
Well, because Wojciech had spent so much time watching the soldiers' behaviors, what Wojciech, this brown bear, did is he went over to where they stored the ammunition, these 500-pound or hundreds of pound crates of ammo, and he started carrying them to the front line.
Wow.
Where the artillerymen were. And so throughout that battle with bullets zinging around him, and what does Wojciech care? What the you know about bullets, right? He's just like carrying as he had seen the humans do. And everybody was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Hey, everybody. Welcome to our first episode of WTF History. This is episode 1. This is where my fellow presenter, Mike Gatto, and myself, we share stories from history that we think will make you go, what the And as you know, I think as everybody knows, Mike, you and I are, kind of history nuts. And you and I talk about this stuff in person all the time. But we felt, it'd be kind of cool if we could throw our stories out there as in a series and just have people in the comments let us know who they think had the better story.
Yeah, so in these episodes, we're going to pick one loose topic. It might be medieval times, it might be British history, it might be World War II. And we're each going to give what we believe is the most mind-blowing historical fact from that period. It's going to be brief. It's going to be something that you can digest pretty easily. But then we want you, the readers, to tell us which of our 2 historical facts of that area is the most mind-blowing.
Yeah. So it's a pretty simple concept, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And I know you and I have enjoyed coming up with it and doing the research on that. So today's theme is going to be World War II. And who wants to go first?
Oh, I do. You teacher.
Okay. All right, Mike, what is your story?
All right. So what I want to talk about today is the crazy statistics from the Battle of Stalingrad. And there's 2 in particular that I'm going to focus on, but I think obviously, like much else, there's a little lead up that needs to happen. So obviously the context of Stalingrad, the year was 1942. The German army had advanced and was shelling Moscow. At some point, Hitler said, no, don't try to capture Moscow, focus on Stalingrad. Now the madman theory says that his focus on Stalingrad was because the city was named for his arch rival, Joseph Stalin. The rational theory says that the German army was focused on Stalingrad because they wanted to get to the Caucasus oil fields, or just to the south of it. And this was a key strategic point. But in any event, the German army continued advancing and advanced so fast that through the summer, that as winter approached, they were still in their summer uniforms. And their supply lines were very, very stretched. And what you had in the late summer and the early fall is that the German 8th Army captured the city. And there started to be bitter fighting. The fighting was house to house, street to street. There's a famous radio call, and there's many examples of this where, the command headquarters says, hey, Company B, how's it going over there? And Company B says, oh, it's going great, Commander. We've captured the living room, but we're facing weird resistance in the kitchen. I mean, it was bitter fighting. And there's also a scene that has been relayed much that talks to you about how bitter the street fighting was in Stalingrad. At some point, you had German forces and Russian forces facing off against each other across a small alley. And they were blasting each other with machine guns at, not quite point blank range, but very close. And at some point, the Russians yelled out in German, cease fire, so that each side can process their own dead. And the Germans said, okay, yeah, sure. Cease fire. We can process our own dead. And on one side were the Russians, where they were grizzled veterans. They've been fighting on the, what was known as the Eastern Front for years. And on the other side were the somewhat idealistic young German soldiers. So they both come out waving a white flag and they start processing their own dead. The Germans start taking out the dog tags. They start taking off the dog tags from their dead. And they start taking out of their pockets the letters that they had written home. And then they look up and they see the Russian soldiers robbing their corpses for bread, right? And at that point, they realized that this was going to be a crazy fight. And a crazy fight it was. And here's where we're getting to the mind-blowing statistics. So after the Germans captured Stalingrad, Stalin was able to call up to conscript another 1 million soldiers. And the Germans had no idea that he was doing this behind the lines. There was a complete intelligence failure. As you can imagine, they didn't have good spy planes flying in, Tatarstan and places where Stalin was calling up all these men. And by mid-November, it was 40 below in the city of Stalingrad. And the Soviets surprise attacked. And by November 23, they had surrounded about 400,000 German soldiers and their allies, Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians. The life expectancy for a Soviet private who was dropped into Stalingrad was 23 hours. I want you to think about that. You're called up, you're drafted, you're going off to war, you give your young lady a kiss goodbye, you wave bye to your parents, and the Soviet army says, oh, we're taking you to this big battle, this glorious battle called Stalingrad. They drop you in, your life expectancy, 23 hours. 23 hours, less than a day.
Less than a day.
That is how crazy it was. The Soviet army executed 13,500 of their own soldiers for desertion. So more than a quarter of all the US casualties in Vietnam, the Soviets just executed people. They said, hey, no, you're going the wrong way. We're going to shoot you. For the Germans, meanwhile, Stalingrad had turned into a propaganda disaster and an actual disaster. The German high command had went from saying that the soldiers would all be home for Christmas to a few days after Christmas having to announce on the radio that the soldiers surrounded in Stalingrad had agreed to fight until there was one bullet left. Well, what does that mean? Well, they would use all their bullets on the enemy, and then the last one they would use on themselves. In January, when the forces were surrounded, Hitler promoted the German commander Paulus to field marshal, 5-star general, that's the equivalent, and no field marshal had ever surrendered in the history of European history. So there's a clear message, do not surrender, right? From January through March, a German soldier died every 7 seconds, and it was mostly from starvation. And they knew this. They knew that a German soldier died every 7 seconds. How did they know this? Well, because the Soviet army put it on loudspeakers. They brought loudspeakers up to the front, and for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they played a message. A German soldier dies every 7 seconds. Bang! A German soldier dies every 7 seconds.
Wow.
Bang! Psychological warfare for months and months and months. The Soviet Union suffered an incredible 1.3 million casualties at this one battle. They got the last 20,000 German holdouts to surrender by offering them soup. They had been living off horse meat, rats, black pepper, and cannibalism for 4 months. The total Axis forces, Romanians, Germans, Italians, so on and so forth, was 925,000 soldiers. Of those, 919,000 were casualties. Just 6,000 came home, and they came home 12 years later. They were taken prisoner. They had to go to Siberia and do forced labor for 12 years. So just 6,000 of the original 925,000 came home. To put these statistics in perspective, this is what I want you to do. I want you to imagine how much the Vietnam War tore apart this country. I mean, it's tore us apart. We almost didn't survive. There were riots in the street. Well, people were, facing off in all these awful, protests and things like that. Well, in the Vietnam War, the United States had roughly 50,000 deaths. You take that and you multiply that by 20.
Yeah,
that's at the minimum how much each side lost at this one battle. And to put it in greater perspective, I want you to imagine all the U.S. combat casualties since the beginning of the United States. So this is the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, the War of 1812, so on and so forth, the War on Terror, so on and so forth. Now you double that. And again, that's how many each side lost in this one battle. It was truly, truly, truly a very crazy time. I'm blown away that this was just 81 years ago. And so for a few generations ago, and I close with a thought, if you think you have it tough, just think about this episode and just think Stalingrad.
Mike, that's a great story, and I am familiar with Stalingrad, but not with those statistics. Those are amazing, and you and I talk about this all the time. They have these fatal cases of presentism, where everything that happens today is the worst that's ever happened. Every leader is no existential threat to our. It's like they'd have no idea what people have gone through merely 2 generations ago. Or you know what? Some people are going through now, but you just don't know about it because it's not presented on the news. But I wish people would see how. I wish more people would know about what happened in Stalingrad. I had a fighter on the show, Slava Claus, and he is from Stalingrad, and he said that everyone in Stalingrad knows how hard and everything that happened, and they all blame it on Stalin, right? For
Fascinating.
doing this to their city and their community. And he got very, very emotional about it when I talked to him. So that's how deeply they felt it, because they must have all lost someone
Yeah.
in that battle.
Absolutely. I mean, the horrors that city went through hopefully will never be repeated. But as I study, these historical facts, of course, we are kept in mind that, or I always remember that there is a war going on still in the eastern part of Europe, and some of the trench-like warfare there, not quite as bad as Stalingrad, but it's got to be awful for both sides involved.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, the way in which those people, those young men died, and families, right? Families, civilians, huge civilian toll in
Sure.
Stalingrad. But the way they died was not, easy. It was not clean. It was
Yeah.
not antiseptic. They were the most horrible deaths that you could imagine
Yeah.
in a wartime.
Now you have a World War II story as well, and it also comes from the eastern part of
Mine is perhaps a little nicer. Mine
Not
is
so
kind of
depressing.
friendly. Mine is about Wojciech the bear that fought for the Polish army. And when I say he fought for the Polish army, I mean that sincerely. He actually was enlisted into the Polish army and had a rank, a social security number, and received a paycheck.
Wow.
So in 1939, the Germans took over Poland. They swept through Poland, and at that point in the war, they still had agreements with the Soviet Union. They had not really, attacked the Soviet Union at that time. So the Soviets agreed to, transport about 325,000 Polish citizens into the Soviet Union in POW camps, and they kept them there. At the same time, there was a Polish, government in exile, and they were still trying to operate as a government, and they're doing what they could do. But in 1941, right when the Germans started attacking the Soviet Union, all of those sorts of agreements fell apart. And the Soviets said, well, hey, we have all these Polish people. Why don't we release them? We start to, transport them out of here because, to be honest, because of the things like you've talked about with Stalingrad, they couldn't afford them. They couldn't afford to keep them anymore. So what they allowed them to do is create an army, right? Because you got all these Polish people who have been moved into the Soviet Union, and they've got a lot of pride in their country, and they want to do something. They want to fight the Germans, right? They want to win their country back. And so they allowed them to create what was called the Anders Army, and it was named after their leader. He was a General Anders. And so what this army would do is this army was made up of people who came out of the POW camps, and initially it was about 10,000, but it grew in size to be about 75,000, including civilians and others. And it worked under the Polish government in exile and jointly with the Soviet Union. I mean, if we're to look at your story regarding Stalingrad, I mean, this is a way for the Soviets to be able to get more, more people into the war effort and get them off of their dole. Right? They didn't want to. They could not afford to keep them up in these POW camps anymore. They just couldn't. So what they did was they allowed them to organize down in Uzbekistan, and I think a lot of our viewers, are, I don't know if they're viewing this, they probably know, but many of the younger viewers don't realize that a lot of those countries were actually part of the Soviet Union. Uzbekistan, all the stands, those were all part of the. They were all part of the Soviet Union. So it was very, very, very large. So they were down in Uzbekistan. and the Germans were in Iran. But then at one point, the Soviets and the Brits took over Iran. Right? They had the battles in Iran, and that became Allied territory. So the Soviets allowed Anders' army to move down into Iran, and they could keep peace there, patrol it, do what they do, because they were now a functioning artillery division. So on the trip through the mountains to get to Iran, because those of you who aren't familiar, there are huge mountain ranges surrounding Iran to the north, and they encountered a little shepherd boy on April 8th, 1942, and the little shepherd boy had a baby bear, a little bear cub, very very young little brown bear in a bag. And there was a woman there, an 18-year-old civilian who was traveling with Anders' army, and she fell in love with the bear. It's like, oh my God, we can't let this bear just like live in a bag, She probably said it in Polish though, and she's like, we got to do something, And so they bought the little bear cub from the shepherd in the mountains. So they continued their journey down into Tehran, and they gave him the name Wojciech, because he was a happy bear. He was gregarious. He didn't have a mean bone in his body. And he learned to live with the Polish soldiers while he was there stationed in Iran with the division. And he would and people are going to get upset about this, but hey, it was the 1940s. He would smoke cigarettes, and he would have signals which he would give them to say, I wanted a cigarette. He would drink. He drank alcohol with the Polish soldiers, because of course he did, because they're Polish soldiers.
Well, hold on. I got to interrupt you just there. We were just talking about how, in a very serious tone when I did Stalingrad, we were talking about how people might not be as tough or as used to hardship as they were. If you're sitting in a trench having a few vodkas with a bear, you're a pretty tough person, I would think, because I would not want to, sit back in a trench and throw a few back with a bear.
Right. Right. Well, I think, Mike, I think they had experience with this bear and his personality, where they knew that this might be a safe endeavor. But by the way, the bear did go to a POW camp for a little bit with Irina. I had forgot to put that in there. And she eventually was like, this is no place for a bear. Like an army division was. So she donated it to the transport company, which later became the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. They're in the deserts of Iran. All right, so here's where we get a little interesting. So in 1943, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company received orders to go to the front, and the front at that point for them would have been Italy. There was a huge battle taking place. There were a lot of little skirmishes taking place, but it looked like everything was going to come to a head at a place called Monte Cassino. And Mike, I know you're salivating because I'm talking about Italy. So, and I'm sure you're very familiar with Monte Cassino,
of course,
and the battle that happened there. But you didn't know this. So the Polish soldiers, the 22nd Artillery Supply Division, they had become very attached to the bear. He loved to wrestle. Wojciech means happy warrior. So he was just honestly really happy warrior. And they were, having fun with him. And now they had to leave him in Iran. And so the soldiers were upset because they're like, we can't leave this guy. But of course, regulations would not allow you to transport a bear, one, on the military transport, secondly, to a frontline battle position. So what they did is they decided, well, you know what? We're kind of our own army here. We are Poland, because they were acting with, under a government in exile. So they decided to enlist Wojciech into the Polish army. And to make it official, they gave him a serial number. They gave him a rank. He was a private, and they gave him a paycheck. And Wojciech, because he now was officially a Polish soldier, enlisted in the Polish army, they allowed him, believe it or not, of course, because it's a government in exile, they allowed him to be transported to Italy, to the battlefront of Monte Cassino. It gets better, Mike. So, as you know, the Battle of Monte Cassino was a horrific scene in Italy. One of the bloodiest. Over 70,000 people died in the battle in that battle on all sides, right? And so it was a lot of hand to hand, like kind of what you described down in Stalingrad, but also a lot of heavy artillery, right? And Monte Cassino is this place that's on top of this big rock mountain, and that's it's what it was. And so the Allies were holed up there. So they actually took Wojciech de Beer to the front with them, the artillery division, and he had a handler named Heinrich. But at some point, because the battle was so bloody and so many people were dying, his handler had to be called up to the front, away from the artillery division, to be a spotter, a signalman, and so he had to leave Wojciech. Well, during the battle, Wojciech, because he was a really smart little bear, he had been watching the behavior of all the soldiers around him. And he had been, just watching them for hours as to what they did. So Heinrich left, and he was really worried because, like, what's going to happen with the bear? He's probably going to get killed. He's probably going to wander off, because everybody's just trying to save their lives at that point and fight a war. Well, because Wojciech had spent so much time watching the soldiers' behaviors, what Wojciech, this brown bear, did is he went over to where they stored the ammunition, these 500-pound or hundreds of pound crates of ammo, and he started carrying them to the front line.
Wow.
Where the artillerymen were. And so throughout that battle, with bullets zinging around him, and what does Wojciech care? What the you know about bullets, right? He's just like carrying as he had seen the humans do. And everybody was like, "Oh my God, this is amazing!" So, as you know, the Allies ended up winning there, and went on to, in short order, go back and take over Europe, and take over Italy, take over Europe, or take back. Sorry. But everyone called Wojciech a hero after that, and so much so was he a hero that the 22nd Artillery Division, they changed their seal. I was in the military. We all have seals. We all have the little patch that we wear, and they changed it to be a patch of a bear with a piece of artillery in each arm, walking towards a firing cannon. By the way, a movie has been made of this I think in sometime in the 2010s. I haven't seen it, but
I'm concerned about the quality of said movie, Dave.
Yeah, I don't want to see it.
With you.
I think if you're watching this, you should probably just take this in as your story.
Yeah.
Because I'm concerned about how they effed with it. But after that, Wojciech, the 22nd Artillery Division, was stationed in Scotland after the war ended, and they took Wojciech with them, and he became a local celebrity because you got a brown bear hanging out with dudes, smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, and wrestling. And so all the Scots came around and hung out with the bear, and he was then moved to the Edinburgh Zoo, where he stayed in Edinburgh. And he was a celebrity at the Edinburgh. God, this dude had a gifted life, man. From a bag of a shepherd, right, to being a local celebrity in Scotland. I can imagine that the weather was a lot better for his furry ass up in Scotland than it was in the deserts of Iran. To the day he died at the age of 21, which is pretty good for a bear. To the day he died, ex-Polish soldiers who served with Wojciech would come and visit him. And they all say the same thing. Every time he would see them, he would give them the signal for, "Give me a cigarette, give me a drink." He wanted his alcohol, and he wanted his smokes.
That's so funny.
By the way, he was retired from the military, and he received a raise. He retired as a corporal.
Wow.
So that is the story of Wojciech, the fighting bear.
An amazing story, way more uplifting than mine.
It is. Actually, honestly, Mike, I teared up while I was doing my research on this about Wojciech just hanging out in Scotland and all these, 70-year-old, soldiers coming to visit him and pay their dues.
Veterans, reliving the day. So, great story. Folks, we want your opinion. Please vote in the comments which story is more mind-blowing. Which story made you say WTF?
All right, Mike. Thanks. We'll see you next time. Hey, if you like what you hear, like and subscribe. It really means a lot, and we would love to have you coming back every week. Thank you.